It was a quiet evening on the military base, the kind of stillness that Jack had grown accustomed to. The last light of day was fading into the horizon, leaving behind a darkened sky dotted with stars. Jack stood alone by his truck, checking his equipment one last time. His loyal companion, Max, a sleek German shepherd, sat at attention beside him, his ears pricked to the sounds of the night. Jack knew something was about to happen. He could feel it in his bones, but he couldn't quite place why. Jack had been on countless missions, each one as dangerous as the next, but tonight was different. There was an odd, inexplicable tension in the air, a whispering unease that seemed to creep along the edges of his thoughts. His fingers brushed over the worn leather of Max's collar, the comfort of his dog's presence steadying him. "Ready, buddy," Jack muttered, not expecting a reply. But Max's soft whine was all the answer he needed. Jack grinned slightly, though his smile didn't reach his eyes. Tonight, they were heading out on a simple recon mission, nothing more than a few hours of patrol through the forest, checking for any signs of enemy movement. Max's eyes locked onto his, and for a moment, it seemed as though the dog understood something Jack didn't. The soldier hesitated, his instincts telling him to be alert, but he shook off the feeling. "It's just another mission," he whispered, mostly to himself. "Nothing to worry about." Jack climbed into the truck's cab and started the engine. The low rumble echoed through the base, briefly cutting through the quiet. Max hopped into the passenger seat without being told, his eyes scanning the surrounding area. As they drove out of the gates and into the forest, Jack glanced over at his dog. Max's focus was razor-sharp, his head held high, ears slightly forward. He was usually calm, but tonight he was different. Jack noticed how the dog's gaze shifted every few moments, as though he was listening to something Jack couldn't hear. The drive into the thick of the forest felt longer than usual, as if time itself had slowed. The shadows stretched long under the trees, the moonlight barely piercing the canopy above. Jack had been out here before, many times, but tonight, it felt like the woods were holding their breath, waiting for something. As they reached their usual patrol route, Jack's thoughts were interrupted by Max's sudden low growl. Jack's hand instinctively reached for the rifle beside him. Max was still growling, but there was no sign of danger. No movement, no sound beyond the usual whispers of the wind through the trees. Jack slowed the truck, turning to Max, whose eyes were now fixed on something far ahead. He wasn't barking, but there was an urgency in the way he looked at Jack, a kind of silent plea. "What's going on, Max?" Jack asked softly, his voice barely above a whisper, as if speaking too loudly might break the eerie quiet that enveloped them. Max let out a sharp bark, more insistent this time, his body tense with readiness. Jack's pulse quickened, his senses on high alert. The dog never acted like this unless there was something to worry about. Jack leaned forward, squinting into the darkness. The trees ahead seemed to hold no secrets, but his instincts were telling him otherwise. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, just beyond the reach of his vision. "Stay alert, boy," he muttered, his grip tightening on the steering wheel as he slowly drove forward, his eyes flicking from the road to the woods on either side. Max's growl deepened, vibrating through the air. And then, without warning, the dog leaped from the truck, landing silently on the ground. Jack barely had time to react before Max darted off into the woods, disappearing into the darkness like a shadow. Jack's heart raced as he jumped out of the truck, calling after him. "Max, come back here." His voice was sharp now, a command rather than a plea, but there was no response. Panic began to claw at the edges of Jack's mind as he followed the path Max had taken. He pushed through the underbrush, the crunch of leaves and twigs beneath his boots breaking the silence. His breath came faster, each step taking him further into the unknown. Max was always so reliable, so predictable. This behavior was unlike him. There was something wrong. Jack had no choice but to trust his dog's instincts. Max had been trained for this, trained to protect, to guide, to sense danger before Jack could even see it. Suddenly, Jack stopped in his tracks. Ahead, barely visible in the dim moonlight, he saw Max standing perfectly still, his body rigid, his eyes locked on something ahead. Jack could feel the hair on the back of his neck stand up as he approached. He had no idea what Max was staring at, but the dog wasn't moving, wasn't barking. His ears were forward, eyes unblinking. Jack crouched beside him, his own gaze following the line of sight. At first, there was nothing, just the forest stretching endlessly into the distance. Then, Jack saw it, a faint glimmer of light, almost imperceptible, reflecting off something in the trees. He squinted, trying to make sense of it. It was too far away to be anything normal, yet it felt too familiar, too deliberate. Max growled again, this time louder, more urgent. Jack's heart skipped a beat. His hand instinctively reached for his rifle, but his mind raced. This was no ordinary patrol. Something was out there, and Max was trying to tell him exactly that. The darkness ahead seemed to shift, a figure emerging from the shadows. Jack's breath caught in his throat as he realized the shape wasn't a shadow. It was a person, but not one of his comrades. The figure was barely standing, swaying as if injured, their movements slow and unsteady. "Who the hell is that?" Jack whispered, barely able to process what he was seeing. Max took a step forward, his body low to the ground, eyes fixed on the figure. Jack's instincts screamed at him to stay back, but his duty as a soldier pushed him to move closer. The wounded figure, now almost fully visible, dropped to their knees. Jack hesitated, unsure of what to do. Was this a trap? Was it a decoy, meant to lure him in? Max growled again, warning him. Something wasn't right. Jack's grip tightened on his rifle, his pulse thumping in his ears. "Stay close, Max," he whispered, stepping forward carefully. The dog's gaze never left the figure, his stance ready to spring into action at any moment. The figure looked up at Jack, their face pale and drawn. There was an unreadable expression in their eyes, but it wasn't one of a soldier. They were something else entirely. Jack's breath caught. His instincts were screaming now. Max had never been wrong before. Whatever this was, it was about to change everything. The air was thick with tension, and Jack felt his heart pounding in his chest as he slowly approached the figure kneeling in front of him. Max stayed close, his eyes never leaving the stranger, his low growl reverberating softly in the otherwise silent forest. The dog's body was coiled, every muscle taut with readiness, as though he could spring into action at any moment. Jack stopped a few feet away from the figure, his rifle still gripped tightly in his hands. The moonlight filtered through the trees, casting eerie shadows across the forest floor, but it wasn't enough to make out many details of the stranger. The person was covered in dirt and blood, their clothes torn and ragged, their face bruised and battered. But there was something about their eyes that seemed almost unnatural in their intensity. They were a pale shade of blue, almost glowing in the dim light, like they were not entirely of this world. "Who are you?" Jack asked, his voice firm but laced with uncertainty. His mind raced, calculating every possible outcome. Was this a trap? A trick meant to lure him deeper into enemy territory? Or was it something else entirely? His instincts, honed through years of service, told him to proceed with caution, but something about the person in front of him kept him rooted to the spot, as though his body couldn't move even if it wanted to. The figure slowly lifted their head, their eyes meeting Jack's, and for a brief moment, time seemed to stop. There was a strange familiarity in the gaze, a knowing, as though they had seen each other before, even though Jack was certain he'd never laid eyes on this person in his life. The figure opened their mouth, but no words came out. It was as though they were trying to speak but couldn't. Jack took a step forward, his voice softer this time. "Are you hurt? Can you understand me?" He knew it was a long shot. The figure's appearance, dirty, injured, and covered in the remnants of battle, didn't exactly scream friendly. Yet there was something about them that kept Jack from aiming his rifle, despite every instinct telling him to do so. Max growled again, a low, throaty sound that seemed to vibrate in the air between them. The dog was clearly unsettled, and Jack felt a flicker of doubt gnawing at him. But still, he hesitated. There was a bond between him and Max that went beyond just soldier and pet. The dog had always been able to sense things Jack couldn't. If Max wasn't attacking, it meant there was something else at play here, something Jack wasn't seeing. The figure's lips parted again, but this time, the words came out in a slow, labored whisper. I. The voice was barely audible, almost like the person had to gather every ounce of strength to speak. I need your help. Jack frowned, uncertainty clouding his thoughts. Help. From me. You're one of them, aren't you? His mind flashed to the possibility that this might be an enemy soldier in disguise, some kind of psychological warfare meant to confuse him. But even as he thought it, he knew that something felt off. His gut told him this wasn't a simple case of enemy infiltration. The figure's gaze seemed to deepen, the faint light in their eyes flickering with an unspoken urgency. Not what you think, they whispered, their voice trembling with exhaustion. The figure paused, their hand shaking as they reached for their side, where a large, blood-soaked wound marred their torso. Jack's eyes darted to the injury, and he immediately noted the severity of it. This wasn't just a scratch or a minor wound, it was a deep, lethal injury, and the person was clearly on the edge of collapse. Before Jack could respond, Max took a few cautious steps forward, his nose twitching as he sniffed the air around the figure. Then, unexpectedly, the dog barked, loud and sharp. Jack's heart jumped in his chest, and he spun around, scanning the surrounding forest. There was a rustling in the trees, a faint sound that was almost imperceptible against the quiet of the night. Someone, or something, was watching them. Get down, Jack ordered, his training kicking in. Without thinking, he dropped to a crouch, keeping his rifle ready, his eyes scanning the shadows. Max was already in a defensive stance, his body low to the ground, growling softly. The air was heavy with tension, and Jack knew they weren't alone. The stranger in front of him had been wounded, but Jack wasn't sure if that meant they were an ally or just a pawn in a larger, more dangerous game. The figure, still kneeling, didn't seem to notice Jack's sudden shift in attention. Their head drooped again, and they seemed to be losing consciousness. Jack quickly moved closer, kneeling beside them, his mind racing. The figure's breath was shallow, their body trembling with each breath. He couldn't just leave them here. It was clear that they were in no state to defend themselves, and something about this entire situation felt more complicated than just an ambush. But then there was the problem. Max had reacted to something. Jack wasn't sure if it was the figure or something in the distance, but it was clear that they weren't alone. The rustling in the trees was growing louder now, unmistakable, as if more people were closing in. Jack's grip tightened around his rifle, his eyes darting between the figure and the trees. "Stay with me," Jack muttered, his hand moving instinctively to check the figure's wound. It was a mess, and Jack knew he didn't have much time. The bleeding was severe, and though the figure's breathing was slow and ragged, they seemed to be fighting to stay conscious. "I'll get you out of here," Jack whispered, though the words felt hollow. His mind was already calculating his next move. And then, just as he thought the situation couldn't get any more complicated, the air shifted. There was a low hum, barely audible at first, but it grew louder. A vibration, almost imperceptible, like the very earth beneath their feet was trembling. Max barked again, but this time, there was a distinct note of fear in his voice. Jack's eyes shot to the sky, and his stomach dropped as he realized what was happening. They weren't just surrounded by enemy soldiers, they were surrounded by something far worse. Max's growl deepened into a snarl, and Jack knew that whatever was out there, they weren't alone anymore. Something was closing in, and this night, this simple patrol was about to spiral into something far darker than Jack could have imagined. Jack's heart raced as the vibrations beneath his boots grew stronger. Max was still on edge, his hackles raised, his body low to the ground, ready to spring into action at the slightest provocation. Jack glanced back at the stranger, who was now barely conscious, their body trembling with the effort to stay awake. The rustling in the trees had intensified, and Jack could feel the weight of the unseen eyes closing in from all directions. There was no longer any doubt in his mind. This was no simple patrol. This was something much more dangerous, something that neither he nor Max could have anticipated. Max's ears perked up, his head swiveling in the direction of the hum, which was growing louder, now unmistakable. It was a deep mechanical sound, like the steady rumble of an engine, or the vibrations of a large craft hovering just out of sight. Jack's instincts told him they were not alone on the ground, but in the sky as well. Whatever was coming was big, and it was coming fast. Jack clenched his jaw. His hand tightened around his rifle, but there was little he could do with no clear target. The forest around them was dense, and the shadows seemed to deepen by the second. The only sounds now were the eerie hum in the distance and Max's low growls, which had taken on a more aggressive tone. The dog's hackles were still raised, but there was a new urgency in his movements, like he was on the edge of a breaking point. "Stay close," Jack muttered under his breath, barely aware he was speaking. He hadn't taken his eyes off the sky for even a second, his mind racing. What kind of force was closing in on them? And why did Max sense it first? There was no time to think about it too much, though. The immediate danger was the injured stranger lying at his feet. Max let out a sharp, piercing bark that echoed through the trees, his body tensing like a coiled spring. Jack spun to look at him, but in that split second, everything changed. The hum from above grew to a deafening roar, and without warning, a shadow passed over them, blotting out the moonlight. Jack's heart stopped in his chest as a massive dark shape loomed overhead, barely visible against the blackened sky. His mouth went dry. It wasn't just a craft. It was something far larger, something that could only belong to an enemy force, or worse, an unknown alien presence. The size of it was impossible to comprehend, like a dark cloud made of metal, hovering silently above the trees, casting a shadow that seemed to stretch for miles. Max, sensing something even Jack couldn't, started barking furiously, his body writhing in the tension of the moment. Jack couldn't tear his eyes away from the descending craft. It had no markings, no insignia, nothing that could indicate who or what it was. It moved with a kind of deliberate, controlled descent, as though it was aware of their every move, aware of their every breath. The hairs on the back of Jack's neck stood on end, and a chill ran through his body. The air had shifted completely. This was no longer a mission. This was survival. The figure on the ground stirred slightly, their hand twitching as though they were trying to speak again. But Jack barely noticed. His gaze was fixed on the ship, his mind running through all possible options, none of which seemed promising. He could hear the low whirring of its engines now, the sound reverberating through the forest, rattling the leaves in the trees. The hum was almost hypnotic, like a song of war that had been long forgotten but was now being played again. Max stopped barking suddenly, his eyes locked on the descending craft, the growls fading into a deep, low whine. Jack felt the dog's anxiety like a tangible thing, a weight pressing down on him. Max had never been afraid of anything before, but now there was no question. Something was terribly wrong. Jack's hand tightened around his rifle, but he knew it wouldn't be enough. This wasn't a fight he could win with just a weapon. The enemy wasn't human, and they weren't following the rules of war Jack understood. His mind flashed to the stranger at his feet, the one who had somehow known what was coming, the one who had made it clear they needed help, yet had said so little. Jack couldn't shake the feeling that this person, this mysterious figure, was the key to understanding what was happening. The craft was getting closer now, the shadow above them growing darker, more oppressive. Jack's breath caught as the silence of the night was shattered by a sudden flash of light. A beam shot down from the ship, a concentrated column of white that illuminated everything in its path. For a moment, Jack was blinded by the brightness, his hand instinctively reaching up to shield his eyes, though he knew it wouldn't help. Max let out a high-pitched whine, and Jack snapped his gaze back to the stranger. The beam of light was now focused directly on them, bathing the injured figure in its glow. Jack's heart slammed in his chest. The figure wasn't moving, wasn't even reacting to the light, as if they were frozen in place. "Max, stay back," Jack hissed, but the dog didn't listen. Instead, Max charged forward, barking wildly, his eyes locked on the stranger. Jack's mind raced. What was happening? Was the light somehow connected to the stranger, or was it something far worse? Before Jack could make a move, the beam of light suddenly flickered, and then with a sharp, almost electric crackle, it snapped off. The forest fell deathly silent once more, the hum of the ship still echoing in the background. Jack blinked, his heart pounding, trying to make sense of what he had just witnessed. The light had come and gone in an instant, and now the forest was once again dark and still. But the stranger was no longer just injured. The blood had stopped flowing from their wound, as if the light had somehow healed it. Their eyes, once pale and weary, now glowed brighter than before, and their breathing was steadier, more controlled. The change was instantaneous, like someone had flipped a switch. Jack couldn't believe what he was seeing. The figures slowly pushed themselves up, their movements still stiff, but with an undeniable strength returning to their limbs. They stood, not fully, but enough to look Jack directly in the eyes. For the first time, they spoke. "You were right to help me," the figure said, their voice now clear, no longer a faint whisper. "But you don't understand what's coming." Jack took a step back, his grip still tight on his rifle, unsure of what to do next. The words sent a chill down his spine. He had no idea what kind of war he had stumbled into, but he knew one thing for certain. Things were about to get a whole lot more complicated. Max, who had stopped barking, now stood by Jack's side, his eyes still locked on the figure, a growl rumbling deep in his throat. Jack's gaze darted between the figure and the ship above them. The craft was hovering motionless, waiting, as if it were biding its time. And in that moment, Jack realized that the true battle was only just beginning. The moment the figure stood up, there was a shift in the air, something palpable that pressed down on Jack's chest, like the weight of an unseen storm. The world seemed to narrow, to contract around him, and for a brief instant, Jack felt like a pawn, caught in a game far bigger than he could ever understand. The forest, still and silent only moments ago, now seemed alive with tension. Max, ever alert, remained at Jack's side, his body tense, ready for anything, but it was clear the dog was as unsettled as Jack. The stranger, no longer just a wounded figure, was something else now, something different. The air around them seemed to shimmer slightly, like a heatwave rising off a distant road, distorting the space between them. Jack watched as their eyes, once dim with pain, now gleamed with an unnatural, almost otherworldly light. They didn't look like a soldier anymore. They didn't even look human. There was something ancient in their gaze, something that didn't belong to Earth at all. "Who? What are you?" Jack's voice cracked slightly, though he didn't mean for it to. His grip on his rifle tightened as the figure took a step closer, moving with fluid, predatory grace. The stranger's lips curled into a faint smile, one that didn't quite reach their eyes. "What I am is not something you are ready to understand," they said, their voice now deeper, richer, like the sound of 1,000 whispered secrets. "But I will help you understand, in time." Jack's brow furrowed, his heart thudding loudly in his chest. There was a strange pull in the way the figure spoke, something that felt almost hypnotic. He shook his head, trying to clear his thoughts. "I don't need your help," Jack replied sharply, though there was a thread of doubt in his words. "I just need to know what's going on here. Who is coming for us? What are you connected to? The stranger's smile faltered, their gaze shifting for a split second toward the sky, where the shadow of the ship still loomed above them, unmoving. Then, without warning, they spoke again, their voice steady but with an edge that made the ground feel unstable beneath Jack's feet. You've already seen the ship. You've heard the hum, felt the vibrations. But it's not just about them, they said, nodding toward the sky. This, everything you think you know, it's all about to change. They've been watching, waiting. Jack's pulse quickened, confusion and fear beginning to tangle in his chest. Who's been watching? What do you mean? They've been waiting. For a moment, the stranger said nothing, their eyes narrowing as they seemed to weigh Jack's words. Then they spoke, but this time, their voice dropped to a near whisper, as though the very air around them was charged with something dangerous. They are not human. What's coming? They have been waiting for millennia. And you? The figure paused, their gaze sharpening, as if piercing straight through Jack. You are the key. The words hit Jack like a slap to the face. His mind raced, trying to process what was happening. The forest around him, the hum in the air, the ship above them. All of it suddenly felt like part of some grand design, something far beyond his understanding. He wanted to ask more, to demand answers, but he could feel the weight of something darker pressing down on him, something he couldn't ignore. Before Jack could speak, a soft, low growl rumbled from Max. The dog had moved slightly forward, his ears flat against his head, his body tense and ready for action. Jack's eyes flicked to Max, then back to the figure, his heart hammering in his chest. The dog was reacting to something, something Jack couldn't see. Something was about to happen. The stranger's eyes flicked toward Max, and for a moment, they seemed to recognize the dog's unease. He senses it, doesn't he? They murmured, almost to themselves. The shift in the air, the change in the winds. You are not just a soldier, Jack. You are part of something much larger. Jack's mind reeled, but before he could respond, the ground beneath them rumbled, the vibrations intensifying, and the hum from above grew louder, almost deafening. The ship was no longer just hovering. It was descending, slowly but surely. The trees around them shook, their leaves rustling wildly as the craft's gravity seemed to pull at the very earth beneath them. Max barked again, louder this time, a warning to whatever was coming. Jack stepped back instinctively, his eyes scanning the tree line, searching for any sign of movement. The air had grown heavy, and the once familiar sounds of the forest had been replaced by an eerie silence. It was as though nature itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to break the tension. And then it happened. From the darkness of the trees, figures emerged, silhouettes shifting in the shadows. Jack's breath caught in his throat. These weren't soldiers. They weren't human, not in any way Jack had ever seen before. Their bodies were long, thin, and covered in a slick, silver-like material that seemed to shimmer in the dim light. Their faces were obscured by strange helmets that reflected the glow of the ship above them, their movements precise and almost mechanical. Jack instinctively raised his rifle, but the stranger, a being who, until this point, had seemed to be on the same side as him, raised a hand. "Wait," they said, their voice commanding and calm. "You don't need that." Not yet. The figures in the trees stopped, and for a moment, all was still again. Jack felt a chill run down his spine. The figures before him were not merely soldiers, they were something else entirely. They were part of the force that had been waiting, waiting for a signal, waiting for the moment when everything would change. The stranger turned to face Jack, their eyes piercing. They'd been waiting for this moment, waiting for you to make the choice. What happens next will depend on what you do now. Jack's mind raced. His fingers still gripped the rifle, but his arm was heavy with uncertainty. He wasn't sure what the stranger was trying to tell him. He wasn't sure what kind of choice he had in the first place. But one thing was certain. Whatever was happening was bigger than anything he had ever faced. And with that, the first thread of realization began to form in Jack's mind. The battle wasn't just against enemies in the forest. It was against something that reached far beyond the trees, something ancient, something waiting. The figures, those strange, shimmering beings, had come for a reason. And Jack, whether he liked it or not, was at the center of it all. The figures in the trees did not move, their dark silhouettes almost blending into the shadows of the night. Their presence was like a suffocating weight on Jack's chest, a quiet promise of impending danger that hung heavily in the air. Jack's grip on his rifle tightened, but he did not raise it, for something in the stranger's voice told him it was not yet time. The silence between them stretched, thick and uncomfortable, as the hum from above seemed to grow louder, reverberating through the very ground beneath Jack's boots. Max, still at Jack's side, was a study in stillness. The dog's ears were flat, his eyes fixed on the beings in the trees. The low growl that had been building inside him had tapered off into a silent tension, as though Max too could feel the weight of what was about to unfold. Jack's heart thudded loudly in his chest, the seconds stretching into what felt like an eternity. But there was no turning back now. The stranger, who was still standing tall despite their earlier wounds, turned their gaze back to Jack, the faint light from above casting strange, unearthly shadows across their face. They said nothing, only stared at him, their expression unreadable. Jack wanted to demand answers, to push them for the truth, but he held his tongue. Something about the stranger's presence told him they were waiting for him to act, to choose, to do something that would determine the outcome of everything. And then, breaking the silence, the stranger spoke. "Do you understand what is happening now, Jack?" Their voice was quiet, almost gentle, but it was layered with a weight that made every word feel like a command. This moment, this crossroads, what happens next is not just your decision. It is the decision of the human race. And you, Jack, you have been chosen. The words sent a cold shock through Jack. He stepped back, feeling the ground shift beneath his feet as if it was buckling under the pressure of the moment. Chosen. He had never asked for this. He had never wanted to be part of anything bigger than the mission he had been given, something simple and straightforward. But now, the air around him seemed to hum with the weight of a reality he couldn't escape, a reality far darker than he had ever imagined. Max's tail stiffened, and Jack glanced down at him, catching a flash of understanding in the dog's eyes. Whatever was coming, whatever was waiting, Max knew it too. Jack forced himself to take a breath, to think past the fear that was rising in his throat. He had to ask, "What do you mean, chosen?" Jack's voice was hoarse, and he cursed inwardly at the vulnerability in it. He wasn't supposed to feel fear, not out here, not with Max by his side. But the truth was, he had no idea what he was dealing with. This wasn't a regular mission. This wasn't even a fight. This was something else, something that stretched beyond the boundaries of his world. The stranger's eyes softened, just slightly, and they took a step forward, closing the distance between them. Their presence was magnetic, drawing Jack in despite the dread swirling in his gut. You were chosen the moment you and your kind began to make noise in the stars. When you first reached the edge of space and began to understand what lay beyond your world, you made yourselves a beacon. That beacon called them here. It called us here. And now, the stranger's voice faltered, as though they were about to reveal something too heavy to carry. Now it's time for you to choose whether your kind will rise or fall. Jack's breath hitched, his mind racing to catch up with the words. He glanced up at the ship still hovering above them, its shadow looming large. The figures in the trees shifted slightly, their movements synchronized and unnerving, but they did not approach. Jack felt the gaze of the stranger's words settle in his chest, like they were branded there. Rise or fall? Jack echoed, barely able to believe what he was hearing. What are you talking about? You want me to just decide the fate of humanity, just like that? The stranger nodded slowly, as though the weight of the decision was something they had carried for longer than Jack could comprehend. It is not just your fate, Jack. It is the fate of everything you know. Your species. It is at a crossroads. What happens next depends on whether you choose to accept your place in the greater universe or whether you deny it. Jack's mind spun as he tried to process the enormity of the situation. The universe. What the hell was the stranger talking about? His eyes flicked to the figures in the trees again, their bodies still but their eyes fixed on him, watching him as though they were waiting for something. He felt a deep sense of unease settle in the pit of his stomach. "What do I have to do?" Jack asked, the words slipping out before he could stop them. His voice was barely a whisper, as if he were afraid of the answer. The stranger's expression softened even further, and for the first time, Jack saw something like sympathy in their eyes. "You have to decide. Will you fight for your species? Will you stand with those who have watched over you, those who have prepared for this day? Or will you stand against them and risk the destruction of everything you hold dear?" Jack took a step back, his mind reeling. This was too much. This was insane. He wasn't a general, he wasn't a king, he was just a soldier, a guy with a dog, doing his job. How could he possibly make this decision? How could he be the one to choose the fate of everything? The responsibility of it crushed down on him. And for a brief moment, he felt the full weight of his insignificance, his helplessness. But then Max nudged his leg, and Jack's heart clenched. The dog's brown eyes met his, steady and unwavering. Max wasn't afraid. Max trusted him. Jack shook his head, forcing himself to focus. The air around him had grown thick with the vibrations of the ship. He could feel it now. This was more than just a decision about humanity. This was about survival. This was about protecting the life he knew, the world he had come from, the people he loved. "I don't know what you are," Jack said slowly, his voice steadying with each word. "But I know one thing. I won't stand by while everything falls apart. I'll fight. I'll stand with my people." The stranger's eyes gleamed with something ancient, something Jack couldn't name. They stepped back, a look of approval passing over their face. "Then you've made your choice." And with that, the tension in the air seemed to snap, like a taut wire that had finally been cut. The ship above them thrummed louder, its presence undeniable, and the figures in the trees began to move, stepping forward with a purposeful, synchronized stride. Jack didn't know what would happen next, but for the first time, he felt something that had been missing. Determination. He wasn't going to let humanity fall without a fight. And with Max at his side, Jack knew they would face whatever came next, together. The tension in the air was palpable, like the calm before a storm that promised to change everything. Jack's heart hammered in his chest, his breath shallow as he tried to steady himself. The decision had been made, but the weight of it was already pressing down on him, heavy and unyielding. The ship above them hummed louder now, its presence undeniable, filling the space around them with an oppressive energy. The figures in the trees had stopped moving. Their synchronized approach seemingly paused, as though they were awaiting some final signal to act. Max, still at Jack's side, was no longer growling or tense, but instead, his body was rigid, his focus entirely on the craft above them. Jack could feel the dog's unease, the subtle tremor in his muscles that spoke of something much larger than they could both understand. It was as though the very air itself had shifted, becoming something strange and unfamiliar, thick with the promise of danger, yet also filled with an odd sense of inevitability. The pieces were falling into place, and Jack had no idea how it would all end. The stranger, who had revealed so little about themselves, stood calmly, their eyes fixed on Jack, as though they were waiting for something from him. Their gaze was knowing, almost as if they had seen this moment play out before, in 1,000 different ways. But Jack couldn't bring himself to ask them more questions. There were no more answers he could receive from them. This was the moment. This was the moment when humanity's fate, and his own, would be decided. "Do you see it now?" The stranger's voice broke through the heavy silence, soft but carrying a weight that made the words feel like they were etched into Jack's very soul. The shift in the world, the change in the winds. This is the turning point. This is the moment when it begins. The first step of a long journey. Jack's eyes flickered between the strange figures in the trees and the craft overhead. The night was thick with the hum of the ship, which had now descended even lower, its shadow blotting out the stars above. Jack felt an odd sense of helplessness wash over him, but it was quickly replaced by a spark of defiance. He had made his choice. There was no going back now. "What do we do?" Jack asked, his voice quieter than he meant it to be. His grip tightened around the rifle at his side, a strange comfort in the familiarity of it, even though he knew it wouldn't be enough. None of it would be enough. The stranger didn't immediately respond. Instead, they stepped forward, the subtle shift in their posture conveying something Jack couldn't place. With slow, deliberate movements, they gestured for Jack to follow them. Max, sensing the change, took a cautious step toward the stranger, his body still alert, but his trust in Jack stronger than ever. Jack followed, a mixture of confusion and determination swirling inside him. The forest seemed to stretch on forever, the path they walked growing more surreal with each passing second. The trees loomed over them like ancient sentinels, their branches twisted and gnarled, as though they had seen things that Jack could never comprehend. The light from the ship above cast eerie shadows, transforming the once familiar forest into something out of a nightmare. "We've been watching you," the stranger spoke again, their voice almost lost in the wind. "Watching your species, your people, as you've stumbled into the stars. You're young. You're brash. You think you're ready for what lies beyond your world. But the truth is, you've been playing a game you don't understand. A game that has been in motion long before your kind even knew you could reach the heavens." Jack tried to focus on the stranger's words, but the unsettling feeling in his gut was growing, pulling at him like 1,000 invisible threads. He didn't know where this was going, but something deep inside him told him that it wasn't good. He could feel the eyes of the figures in the trees on him, watching, waiting, judging. "They've been waiting for you," the stranger continued. "The ones above. The ones who have watched over you for longer than you could ever understand. They have been patient, waiting for the right time. And now, the time has come. The war is not about to begin, Jack. It has already begun." Jack's mind reeled, trying to process what he was hearing. He had never signed up for any of this. He had signed up to fight in wars, to defend his country. But this was something completely different. He had never imagined that the very survival of his world could depend on something as incomprehensible as this. "War," Jack repeated, his voice tinged with disbelief. "I thought we were just a part of some bigger game. You're saying that what happens next is going to change everything, that our whole existence is at risk." The stranger nodded, their eyes still locked onto his. "You are at the crossroads. There is no turning back now. What you do next will determine if your species survives or becomes a casualty of the war to come. But understand this, no matter what choice you make, you are not alone. You are not the only one who has been chosen." The words were a heavy blow, the gravity of them sinking in slowly, like quicksand pulling at Jack's feet. He had known, deep down, that this wasn't just some skirmish, some battle to win. But now, as the reality of the stranger's words began to settle over him, Jack understood. This wasn't just about him. This was about something far bigger than one person, or even one nation. It was about survival, his, humanity's, and whatever forces had been watching them from the stars. They stopped walking, and Jack found himself standing at the edge of a clearing, where the light from the ship above bathed the area in an eerie glow. The figures in the trees were gone now, and all that remained was the ship's presence, vast and unyielding, its shape impossible to ignore. The stranger turned to face Jack, their expression unreadable. "This is it," they said softly. "The choice you make now will determine your future. Will you stand with us, or will you stand against everything that is coming? The path ahead is unclear, but know this, you will not face it alone." Jack's breath caught in his throat. The weight of it all, the enormity of the decision, the fear, the uncertainty, pressed down on him like a suffocating fog. He had always been the one to follow orders, to do what needed to be done. But this was different. This was beyond anything he had ever faced. Max stepped closer to Jack, nudging his leg as though urging him to make the decision. The dog's eyes, calm and steady, seemed to say that whatever happened, they would face it together. Jack looked at Max, then at the stranger, and finally, up at the ship hovering silently above them. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, as Jack's mind worked furiously to make sense of it all. In that moment, he realized that he had already made the decision, even if he hadn't fully grasped its meaning. The battle ahead wasn't just about fighting an enemy. It was about fighting for something larger, something that would shape the future of everything he knew. "I'll fight," Jack said quietly, his voice firm despite the uncertainty. "I'll fight for humanity. I'll stand with you." The stranger's lips curved into a small, approving smile. They nodded, their eyes now filled with something Jack couldn't quite name. "Then the war has truly begun," they said, their voice barely a whisper in the vast silence of the forest. And in that moment, Jack knew that everything was about to change. The ship above them loomed like a dark omen, its presence undeniable and overwhelming. The hum, which had once been a subtle background noise, now reverberated through the very air, vibrating the earth beneath Jack's boots. It was as if the very fabric of reality itself had been stretched, pulled taut by the ship's gravity, drawing everything, him, Max, and even the stranger, into its orbit. The night was silent now, save for the constant, droning hum of the craft and the soft rustling of leaves stirred by an unseen wind. Jack's heart pounded in his chest, his breath quick and shallow as he took a step forward, feeling as though his every movement was somehow weighted, as if the decision he'd made had already set events in motion that couldn't be undone. He glanced at Max, whose brown eyes were fixed on him, steady and unwavering. The dog was always the first to sense danger, but tonight there was no sign of fear in his gaze, just the quiet, unspoken bond they shared, one that had carried them through countless battles, and now it would carry them through whatever came next. The stranger, who had once seemed so distant, so unknowable, stood at the edge of the clearing, their eyes now reflecting the same pale light that came from the hovering craft. Their presence was no longer simply a mystery. It was an integral part of this unfolding drama, one whose true scope Jack couldn't even begin to grasp. They had become something more than just a guide, more than a figure who had appeared at the right time. They were the embodiment of the choice Jack had just made. They had been waiting for him, and now, in the thick of this moment, they seemed to expect something more, something only Jack could provide. "We're almost out of time," the stranger said, their voice low, yet carrying the weight of something ancient. "The ship is already calling the others. They will not wait much longer, and when they arrive, the final phase will begin. You must decide how to play your part in this." Jack's brow furrowed. "What does that mean? You said the war was already here, but what are we really up against?" The stranger's gaze shifted, almost imperceptibly, toward the ship above them, and Jack felt a shiver run down his spine. For a moment, there was no answer, only the pressing silence that enveloped them. Then, with a sharpness that caught Jack off guard, the stranger spoke. "They are not enemies in the way you think. They are not invaders, not in the traditional sense," they said, their voice growing more intense. "These beings, the ones who have come to claim this planet, they have watched your species for millennia. They have studied you, observed your potential, and now they are here to test whether you deserve to survive. The war is not one of conquest, Jack. It is a test of your species' worth. And you are their judge." Jack's pulse quickened. The weight of the stranger's words crushed down on him, and he took a shaky breath, trying to steady his racing thoughts. "I don't understand," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "How could I possibly be the one to judge? You are the one who made the choice to stand up, to fight. You chose humanity's future, and in doing so, you became its representative. The stranger interrupted, their voice gaining strength. You, Jack, have been called to determine whether humanity can survive beyond the stars, or if it will fall, swallowed up by the forces that have come for it. You hold the balance now, and you must decide. Are you worthy of continuing the journey? The air around Jack seemed to vibrate with the gravity of the words, and for a moment, he thought he might collapse under the pressure. He felt like a small figure, a lone soldier in a vast, unknowable universe, standing on the precipice of something far larger than anything he had ever been trained for. A war was coming, but it wasn't a war for territory or resources. It was a war for the survival of humanity itself. Max, sensing Jack's unease, nudged his leg, grounding him in the present. Jack looked down at the dog, his faithful companion who had been with him through it all. The dog's steady, unwavering gaze gave him a sense of clarity, as if Max understood something Jack couldn't yet grasp. Jack turned his eyes back to the stranger, who stood now like an agent of fate, waiting for him to make the call. The decision wasn't just about battle tactics or strategy. It was about something much deeper. It was about survival, about ensuring that humanity wasn't wiped out before it had a chance to truly discover what lay beyond their planet, what lay within their species. "How do I know what to do?" Jack asked, his voice hoarse, the weight of the choice pressing down on him like a physical force. The stranger's eyes softened, their expression unreadable yet filled with something that seemed like compassion. "You don't know, Jack. That's the point. You are not meant to know. Your species has always been defined by its ability to make decisions in the face of uncertainty. You are here to prove that humanity can rise above fear, above doubt, above its limitations. That is what will determine your survival." Jack took a long, steadying breath, feeling the weight of the decision settle in the pit of his stomach. He was not just fighting for survival. He was fighting for something more, something intangible. The future of humanity, the future of his world, rested in his hands, and no one could tell him what the right choice was. There was no clear path forward, no rulebook to follow. This was a test of his courage, of his belief in his people. And he had to decide. The craft above them shifted, and a low, vibrating sound echoed from it, as though it were preparing to take action. The stranger's gaze lifted to the ship, then back to Jack, their expression unreadable. "The others are coming. It's time to decide." Jack's thoughts spun, his mind struggling to keep up with the gravity of the situation. He had never asked for this. He had never wanted to be a part of something so much larger than himself. But the truth was clear now. He had already made the choice. He had already decided to fight, for his world, for his people, for the future. He looked up at the ship, its massive shape now almost too large to comprehend, and in that moment, a fire kindled within him. It was a fire that had been kindling for some time, a fire he hadn't allowed himself to feel until now. He wasn't alone. He had Max. He had the stranger who had shown him the path. And now he had a purpose. Jack stepped forward, his hand steadying on the rifle at his side, his resolve hardening. "I'm ready." The stranger nodded, a small but knowing smile tugging at their lips. "Then the test begins, Jack. Let's see if humanity is worthy." And with that, the figures in the trees moved, their bodies shifting with unnatural precision, as the ship above them released a brilliant beam of light, illuminating the clearing in an almost blinding glow. Jack stood tall, his heart steady, his mind clear, and as the world around him shifted, he knew one thing for sure. Whatever happened next, he would face it with everything he had. For humanity. For the future. The war had truly begun.